Hi everyone, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to talk about the two kinds of cells that are found in your body, as well as the two different ways that those cells reproduce or are formed. So let's start with talking about the kinds of cells that make up most of your body. Most of the cells in your body are what we call somatic cells. Somatic cells are the kind of cells that are diploid. And remember, when we talked about cells that are diploid, this means they have two copies of all of their genetic information. So in my image over here, we see a diploid cell that has two copies of this chromosome that's green, two copies of this chromosome that's red, and two copies of this chromosome that is yellow. Those two copies are coming from mom and from dad. So while they look the same color, they are what we call homologous. They may not have exactly the same information on them. The type of cells that come from mom and dad that allow them to pass along their genetic information are called gametes. So gametes in humans are sperm and eggs, and sperm and eggs are used specifically in what we call sexual reproduction. Gametes are haploid, meaning they only have one copy of each set of genetic information. So if we go back to our image, notice that there's one green chromosome, one red chromosome, and one yellow chromosome. Half of the information is present instead of those two copies. That's why we call it haploid, not diploid. When we talk about building gametes, this is going to introduce us to the new process of meiosis, which is very similar to mitosis, what we talked about before to replicate somatic cells. Now we're going to dive into meiosis, which builds these haploid cells instead. When we look at the processes of mitosis and meiosis, they are very similar to each other in more than just their name. In both of these processes, we start with a parent cell that is diploid. Now, in mitosis, we're going to end up with diploid cells again, but in meiosis, we end up with cells that are haploid, that just have half of that genetic information. For the most part, when we talk about meiosis, it's essentially like going through mitosis twice without copying the genetic information. And we'll talk about step by step what makes them similar or different. But as we're having this beginning discussion here, in module number 9, I want you to consider that mitosis is an example of what we call asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction involves one cell copying itself. Meiosis is involved in sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, the cells that we end up with are different from the cells that we started with. So let's compare and contrast asexual reproduction with sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is all about creating identical offspring. So the cell I started with will look exactly the same as the cells that I end up with. Whereas in sexual reproduction, the ultimate goal is to make things more diverse. So increasing diversity, that's the job of sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, because we're making identical cells, cells that we could call clones of the original cell, we're going to give all of the genetic information in us at the beginning to our offspring cells. So the identical clones have all of the information that the parent cells started with. Compare that to the process of sexual reproduction. Each parent will give half of their genetic information to the offspring, because the gametes that they use to create the offspring only have half of that information. To get a complete set of genetic information, two gametes come together in the process of fertilization and generate an offspring that has a new set of information that only half matches mom and only half matches dad. We've talked about asexual reproduction in our discussion of mitosis, but there are a couple of other processes that other types of cells use that are considered asexual reproduction. When we talk about yeast, they go through a process called budding to create offspring that are identical. Plants use a process called vegetative reproduction, again, going to generate clones or identical offspring. And sexual reproduction is done through the process of meiosis, which we're going to be exploring more in depth. To give you a nice visual representation of these two types of reproduction, we have an image over here on the left showing us asexual reproduction, and an image over here on the right showing us sexual reproduction. Let's start over here with asexual reproduction. Notice that we have a parent cell that's beige in the middle and has red on the outside. When that parent cell divides using asexual reproduction, we generate two offspring that have the same beige color in the middle and red color on the outside. In asexual reproduction, we make offspring that match or are identical to our parent cells. In sexual reproduction, notice that we have two parents that are involved. The first parent is a square that is blue on the outside and the inside. The second parent is a circle that's pink and red. When we go through the process of sexual reproduction, mom and dad, our circle and our square, give half of their genetic information to the offspring. So for example, we get an offspring with a blue center and a red outside, or with a pink center and a blue outside. The idea with sexual reproduction is we end up with offspring that are always different from the parent cells that we started with. With this background, we're going to dive into the process of meiosis in the next video.